And then she said something that really moved me because it suddenly placed your books as well, you know, all of your books in a certain kind of history, a living history of writers who've come before. She said, we thank all the ancestors and we thank all those people who keep on telling stories generation after generation. Because if you don't have those stories, you don't have anything. And I immediately thought, yes, you know, this is what you've been doing with the fiction for a very long time. You've been telling us the stories that we need to hear, and sometimes drawing on the older forms. You know, so often when you deliver a lecture on fiction or something of the sort, you start off with linked stories that are drawn from Bengali folklore or the British days, something of the sort. And it seems to be so important to carry the old together with the new. And is that, do you think, where you're going to go with the next few books, or is it too early to tell?
I do think that, you know, we live in, I would differ with Abdulrazak here about, you know, how disrupted the times are. Because, you know, even in the 19th century or early 20th century or whatever, if you were a villager living in India, really the First World War, Second World War didn't touch you at all. And this was also true, I think, for most people in China lived through a period of incredible disruption where the entire society was disrupted. The thing about the crisis of today is that it's not just the disruptions between the political disruptions. It's that if you're a villager living in Borishal, your land is going under. You know, the whole environment is turning against you in ways that make your ways of life impossible. You know, and I think that is what makes this particular moment and the years ahead so mystifying, really. You know, we just don't know what's going to happen. I mean, you know, you just look at the disruptions every day that are happening everywhere in the world. In Italy, they have 4 extreme weather events every single day. Can you imagine? So these sorts of disruptions I think are literally unprecedented in the history of humanity. How are we going to write about them? I don't think those old forms of the novel really offer us many ways of dealing with this. So, you know, we have to try and find our own ways, all of us. And for me, you know, I've found pre-modern Bengali folklore a source of real enrichment and reinvigoration, if you like. So that's certainly been, you know, very rich field for me. Yes.
I think, you know, this is actually probably a good opportunity to confess to my divided consciousness as a novelist, which is, I feel like novel has been a perfect place, as I said, to describe split human cells, to describe the ambiguity of human affairs. But at the same time, I still think it gives human beings a kind of centrality that perhaps ought to be withdrawn. And perhaps a novel has fetishized the human being or put the human individual at the center of history in a way it shouldn't have, or at least we should start to interrogate that assumption. So when we talk about pre-modern stories or pre-modern tales, I think we're immediately struck by the presence of the non-human in those stories. And I feel like whatever direction we take next, and a greater emphasis on the non-human, or what has been threatened by the human, is important. Because otherwise, you know, we run the risk of a certain kind of intellectual moral narcissism if we keep talking about just the human self and its dividedness over and over again in different contexts, in different historical contexts. I think we certainly need to acknowledge that, I mean, I agree with Amitav that this crisis is unprecedented in one respect. You know, to be faced with planetary extinction, that's not something previous generations have confronted. So this is something quite unique, and it does, you know, it demands from us a degree of intellectual initiative and agility that wasn't demanded previously. And I think the same is true for people working with the novel or people working with storytelling.
Okay, but as far as I see, there is no opposition between the positions. To say that there is a particular crisis, which is obviously climate change, doesn't mean that we now have to turn the full beam of our attention onto that and not continue to focus on ordinary or small lives. It doesn't seem to me that one needs to exclude the other. So why can't the novel just continue doing business as it has been doing, and then these new forms that you're talking about, they come and address the issues that we are now facing? I don't see that one rules out the other.
If I can say something there. You know, the whole question of what is a small life today is itself so interestingly problematized by, all the other kinds of crises we are facing. I was very struck by this in Italy once, because, in Italy now, all the caregivers for the elderly, many of them are Bangladeshi, who actually traveled across, the Sahara, and they've been slaves in Libya, then they've risked their lives on the Mediterranean, to get to Italy. And once I remember I was walking beside this elderly Italian man who was being pushed along by his Bangladeshi caregiver. And this elderly man was bragging about all his sort of commodified adventures, going to the Amazon or going to Angkor Wat or whatever. And the Bengali guy was nodding along. And I just thought to myself, you should, if you want to know about adventure, ask your caregiver. And he's the one who's really adventurous. I mean, the lives they've lived, these young migrants, they're literally unbelievable,
I think our futures are entwined, and that is going to have to reflect in any, whether we address the novel from the human or the more than human perspective. I think both parts of those are going to be urgently needed, and it's time to move to the audience. But before we go, I'm so happy to see all of you start talking among yourselves, because I felt that you've been in conversation anyway, one way or the other, with your books, your writings, the way you think. Is there anything that you want to ask each other before we move to the audience?
When my first books were published, I remember the sort of critical stance in the Anglosphere amongst literary critics and so on. In the first place, they were sort of surprised that this, this Indian guy is writing at all. I mean, it's like the singing dog, isn't it? But back in those days, the whole sort of critical discourse was centered upon this idea that, these unfortunate third world people always write about politics, because politics is sort of endangering their lives. They're writing these narratives of the nation and so on. And which always struck me as so bizarre, because the real narratives of the nation are written in America. You just look at the number of novels which are preceded by American, an American mystery, an American life, etc. But that thing has completely turned around now. In the last 4 years, every single American writer is writing about Trump or the Trump years or something like that. So they've caught up with us.
So here we are, we're closing this session with a lovely provocation. And questions are open to the audience. I can barely see, oh good, the lights are back on. We're going to be kind to people at the back of the hall. So I see one lone hand right there at the back.